At the height of its power in the 1980s, Japan was seen as an unstoppable force. From high-tech innovations to its dominant presence in global trade, the country seemed destined for perpetual growth. But just as quickly as it rose, Japan found itself in a deep economic crisis, a slump that would stretch across an entire decade and beyond. Today we're talking about Japan's lost decade, the financial disaster that brought this global giant to its knees. How did Japan lose its way, and what lessons does this economic saga hold for the rest of us? Let's find out. Picture Japan in the 1980s. Its factories and exports were booming, and the country's influence stretched across the globe. Everything seemed perfect. Japan was the world's second-largest economy, its stock market was climbing at breakneck speed, and Tokyo's real estate? Well, it became some of the most expensive property in the world. In fact, at one point the value of the land surrounding the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was estimated to be worth more than all the real estate in California combined. This rapid rise, however, was built on shaky foundations. The stock market and real estate boom were inflated by easy credit and speculative lending. Banks were giving out loans left and right with almost no oversight because, hey, prices always go up, right? Well, as history has shown us time and time again, what goes up must come down. By the late 1980s, the bubble was dangerously inflated. In December 1989, the Nikkei 225 stock index hit a record high of nearly 39,000 points. But what followed was a dramatic crash. By 1991, the bubble burst. The stock market fell by more than 60%, and real estate prices followed suit, collapsing by over 50% in major cities like Tokyo. Banks were left with massive amounts of bad debt, as the assets they had used as collateral, stocks and real estate, lost their value overnight. But instead of taking decisive action, the Bank of Japan hesitated, even raising interest rates to try and curb speculation. This only made things worse. The crash wasn't just a temporary setback, it marked the beginning of a long, painful period of stagnation. What happened next was something that Japan, and the world, had never seen before. The collapse triggered a deflationary spiral that gripped the Japanese economy for over a decade. And if you think inflation is bad, deflation can be just as destructive. Prices began falling, which might sound like a good thing at first, but it actually created a dangerous feedback loop. As prices dropped, consumers stopped spending, waiting for even lower prices. Businesses, in turn, cut back on investments, which led to slower growth and eventually, job losses. Japan's legendary job security was shattered. Unemployment climbed to nearly 5%, a huge leap in a country that had long prided itself on jobs for life. The situation was so bad that an entire generation of young people entered the workforce in the 1990s without stable jobs, becoming what is now known as the lost generation. But it wasn't just the job market that suffered, the financial sector was in shambles. Banks, stuck with massive amounts of bad loans, faced an existential crisis. Instead of allowing unprofitable companies to fail, they kept lending to them in a desperate bid to avoid bankruptcy. These companies, often referred to as zombie companies, were barely surviving and contributing little to the economy. By 1999, over 20% of Japanese firms were considered zombies. And how did the government respond? With a series of massive infrastructure projects designed to boost growth. But while these projects temporarily propped up the economy, they also ballooned Japan's public debt. By the year 2000, Japan's debt had more than doubled, exceeding 100% of GDP. Fast forward to today, and Japan's debt stands at over 250% of GDP, the highest in the developed world. So, what did Japan learn from this painful chapter in its history? The first major takeaway is that slow, cautious responses to a financial crisis can make things worse. The government and the Bank of Japan hesitated in the early 1990s, failing to address the banking crisis quickly and decisively. By the time reforms came, it was too late to avoid a decade of stagnation. It wasn't until the early 2000s under Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi that Japan began to take meaningful steps toward recovery. Koizumi pushed for bold structural reforms, privatizing key industries and forcing banks to clean up their balance sheets. But while these reforms helped stabilize the financial system, the real turnaround didn't come until 2012, with the introduction of Abenomics. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's economic strategy, dubbed Abenomics, was a three-pronged approach: aggressive monetary easing, fiscal stimulus, and structural reforms aimed at boosting productivity. In short, Abe wanted to break Japan free from its deflationary mindset, and for a while, it worked. Inflation rose, unemployment dropped to record lows, and Japan's economy showed signs of life. But challenges remain. Despite Abenomics, Japan's growth rate has remained relatively modest. Public debt continues to rise, and Japan's demographic crisis is becoming harder to ignore. With one of the world's oldest populations and a shrinking workforce, Japan faces long-term economic challenges that no amount of stimulus can fix overnight. Japan's lost decade wasn't just an economic crisis, it was a wake-up call for the world. It showed us the dangers of speculative bubbles, the importance of quick and decisive financial reforms, and the long-term consequences of deflation. And as other nations grapple with aging populations and mounting debt, Japan's story becomes all the more relevant. While Japan has made strides in recovering from this dark period, it's clear that the scars of the lost decade run deep. Today, Japan stands as both a cautionary tale and a source of valuable lessons for the global economy. Thanks for watching. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into global economics and geopolitics.